I wonder what you all think is the relationship between God and creation. I imagine you don't think about that very much. That's kind of one of those questions that priests and theologians debate and think about in, seminary halls and behind church doors. But you live busy lives. I live busy lives too. But you live busy lives that are full and intense. You don't have time to think about such things in the midst of getting to-do lists done and dealing with budgets and finances, dealing with the holidays and family dynamics. And so for you, it may feel like God's relationship to created order is fairly absent. God's something I go and visit here at church, or maybe in some prayer time I do. But in terms of my day-to-day, life-to-life, task-to-task reality, God may not feel like God's all that there. And the church has sadly not always helped you with that problem. Because I think the church has at times painted a story that I'm going to tell you, and let me see if this sounds familiar. There's a story out there that God created all that is. That God created all the wonderful things, the stars and the sky and the earth and the trees and the water and the mountains. And then God took a big step back and let free will just unfold. And that didn't go so well, did it? No. It's like the world's a mess, right? Things are terrible, people are mad at each other, there are wars, and there's anger, and there's division, and there's racism, and homophobia, and there's sexism, and there's all the terrible things of our world. And so, God came or sent his Son into the world, thus further underlining that God's somewhere else out there, maybe up there, but then came here to redeem and fix it all. Does that story sound familiar to you? I'm seeing some brave head nods. Yeah, that story sounds a little familiar, right? And there are good things about that story. There are points that that story makes that are essential. Like God the Creator and making everything good is so important. And the fact that God is Creator means that God is not exactly the same with creation, right? God is somehow bigger than or cannot be fully contained by creation. And the redemption part of that story is key because, well, it'd be hard for me to stand up here and deny that the world is kind of a mess, wouldn't it be? And it is in such a terrible mess that I don't know who could make it right except for some sort of being that is so full of love and who created it all in the first place that could set it all right again. There indeed is many things in the world that need healing and grace and being corrected and drawn back into the way of love. And our churchy word for that is redeemed. But those two words, those two descriptions, aren't all of it. And in fact, when we only think about those two words, I think it makes sense why we would think of God and creation, God being somewhere outside of it all and mostly absent. But the other word is that God inhabits creation. Or that creation abides in God, or perhaps the best word for it is this big churchy word, incarnation. That indeed, that God fills all things, and that all things abide in God. That the incarnation, the great mystery of it, isn't that just God became human one time long ago, that happened for sure, but that God is always to be found here in our created world. But this is not just New Age, newfangled 1979 theology, as if 1979 was still new. But this reaches further back in our tradition. Like, if you're brave enough, which you must be brave enough to do, if you're brave enough to read like Athanasius, and what a name is Athanasius, right? Wouldn't you love to be named Athanasius? Athanasius. Athanasius, who's one of the earliest church theologians, writing in the early 300s, put it this way, talking about Christmas. God was consistent in working through one man to reveal God's self everywhere, so that nothing was left devoid of his divinity and his self-knowledge. Indeed, if you go a little bit further in the tradition and you read Augustine, however you say his name, and you all know Augustine, he's one of the big hits. Augustine put it this way: since nothing that is could exist without you, he's writing to God, without you, you must in some way be in all that is. Therefore also in me, since I am. And if you are already in me, since otherwise I would not be, why do I cry to you to enter me? I should be nothing, utterly nothing, unless you were in me, or rather, unless I were in you, of whom and by whom and in whom are all things. Indeed, our gospel reading that we read right out there in the central aisle about this great word that emerges and takes on flesh, the whole poem goes on and on about how it's going to come. The word is coming. And then it says that he was in the world, and that the world abided in him, but the world did not know him. And earlier on, I think Augustine is writing about this phrase in John's Gospel: all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. Indeed, John's Gospel, with that in the beginning, and God spoke the word, and the word produced light, should of course remind all of you, because all of you have read the Bible at least once, I am sure, should remind all of us to go back to the beginning. Genesis 1, in the beginning, there was nothing. And then God spoke, let there be light, and it was like the light lifted off from God's own lips, jumped off of God's own tongue, and then there was light. And then God spoke, let there be life, let there be plants and animals, water and people. And it all sprung out of God speaking, God's word. It's like the whole created world lifted off from the lips and the tongue of God. And meditating and thinking on such things has led to more contemporary theologians, like a woman named Sally McFaig, to talk about creation then as more like a continuation of God. It's not the same as God. God is still creator, but it's like the creation proceeds and spills forth from God. And that, in fact, she takes it so far as to say perhaps the whole created order, the whole cosmos, all of it is in fact God's own body. But even if you don't want to go that far, we can say that it is certainly God's masterpiece, God's art. In other words, the whole created order is sacred and holy. It's not something that we're just here, biding our time, waiting for the next thing to come. But in fact, this itself is quite sacred and holy and blessed and filled with God. This is why some of you tell me about how you go, where you find God most is you go out to the oceans or to the forest or to the mountains, and you find God there. And indeed, it is so. Those same great theologians, Athanasius, Augustine, talk about how creation is the first testament of God. And indeed, God can be found in the beauty and the transcendence of a waterfall and an iceberg, in the mountains and the forest, in the stars and in the sea. But not just there, my friends. God can be found and is incarnate in all those human relationships we get enmeshed with. Every time we see loved ones embrace, every time we see someone who offers a warm meal or a warm coat to someone who has no place to sleep, Christ is there. Every time we witness someone listen with great compassion and empathy, every time we hear someone speak with great truth and love, Christ is there, being incarnate and revealed through material things, through human bodies, again and again. But it gets more intimate than even that, my friends. Because you see, God can be found even in your body. In your body. Take a moment just to notice that as you sit here, your lungs fill and they contract. Your heart beats, and your brain functions. And all that's happening without you having to do anything at all. It just unfolds. And so even in your body, in the cells of your being, you might be able to taste, to catch a glimmer of, to see this Christ, this glorious love of God that sustains us and keeps us going. Indeed, that is such a great mystery that of course we would celebrate for 12 whole days about such things.